Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. In the heart of the Milky Way, humanity had made its mark. Earth was no longer the isolated, struggling planet it once was. The United Earth Federation had expanded across hundreds of systems, and its reach was vast. It was in one of these systems that humanity's first direct encounter with the alien race known as the Zara occurred. The Zara were an enigmatic species. Their homeworld, Zillareth, was known for its extreme beauty, an environment of sweeping deserts and shimmering oceans, but it was the Zara themselves that truly captivated those who encountered them. Tall, lithe, and stunningly beautiful, they were often mistaken for gods or goddesses by less advanced species. Their most striking feature, however, was a peculiar ability to influence the emotions of others, a gift of pheromones and a magnetic presence. Humanity's first meeting with a Zara diplomat, however, had been less than ideal. At the heart of the Galactic Union's sprawling space station, one of the largest hubs for interspecies diplomacy, Commander John Ashford was trying to maintain composure during a formal greeting ceremony. The Zara were being introduced to the Federation for the first time. John had been chosen as the human representative for this historic event, though he hadn't expected to be so nervous. The moment the door opened, however, all of his preparations and rehearsals flew out the window. She stood in the doorway, over 10 feet tall, bathed in an ethereal light. Her skin shimmered with a faint, otherworldly glow, while her eyes that felt as though they could pierce through the very core of a person's soul, locked onto his. Her hair, long and silken, fell in waves that seemed to ripple like liquid silver. Her presence, both regal and yet unnervingly intimate, filled the room. John could feel his heart race, his breath faltering as he fought to regain control over himself. Something about her, something in the way she looked at him, seemed to pull at the very core of his being. But it wasn't just John. The room, which had been bustling with conversations moments earlier, had fallen silent. Diplomats, soldiers, and technicians all stood frozen, mesmerized by the sheer power of her presence. The Zara, she had that effect on everyone. "Commander Ashford," she said in a voice that sounded like the melodic hum of a distant star, "I am Lady Erin of the Zara. It is an honor to meet with you." John's mind stuttered. "The honor is mine, Lady Erin." His voice cracked slightly. He could feel the heat in his face, a flush spreading as his gaze unintentionally lingered on her, unable to break away from the intensity of her eyes. And then it happened. A subtle but undeniable heat began to build in the room. Not from the temperature, no, this was something more primal. John felt a sudden surge of warmth spreading through his chest, his pulse quickening as if every nerve in his body was awakening. The others around him seemed to react in much the same way, though their faces remained neutral. But John knew. He could feel it. "Careful, Commander," warned one of his subordinates, Sergeant Alicia, her voice tight with strain. "You're staring at her too long. That's what happens when you—" Before she could finish her warning, John's thoughts were interrupted by the sensation of a fire beginning to build beneath his skin, a rising heat that made it difficult to focus. He quickly turned away, avoiding her gaze. Lady Erin, however, didn't seem to notice. Her smile remained serene, but there was an unmistakable twinkle in her eyes that suggested she was aware of the effect she had on him, and everyone else in the room. "I trust you are well, Commander?" Erin's voice was laced with a gentle, almost playful tone. John blinked hard, attempting to regain control over his thoughts. His face burned with embarrassment, and it took him a moment before he could answer her without stammering. "Yes, Lady Erin. I am quite well." The tension in the room began to slowly dissipate, though a few of the others were still trying to gather their composure. John couldn't help but notice the looks shared between them, shared glances of confusion and fascination. It wasn't just John who had been affected, and that was when John realized the rumors were true. The Zara, especially the females, had an ability to influence others simply by being in their presence. Their pheromones could induce feelings of desire, of infatuation, even of intense lust. But it wasn't just physical, there was something more. It was as if their very presence beckoned you to look at them, to feel connected to them, whether you wanted to or not. John's mind raced. The implications of this were staggering. If the Zara could wield such power, they could easily manipulate the weaker-willed among them. But Lady Erin wasn't here to dominate. She wasn't here to take control. Not yet. She was a diplomat, and John was going to have to figure out how to work with her, navigate this strange and dangerous allure she exuded, without succumbing to it. Little did he know, their brief meeting would be the beginning of a far greater, more complex struggle. One that would stretch across galaxies and alter the fate of both humanity and the Zara. For now, however, John could only focus on one thing: not staring at her. Because the longer he did, the hotter things would get, and not just in the room. John Ashford couldn't shake the image of Lady Erin from his mind. The way she stood, poised and radiant, her presence so overpowering that it left the entire room quivering in a state of confused awe, it was almost impossible to look away. But after that initial encounter, John found himself desperately trying to regain control over his senses. He had never before experienced anything like this feeling of being completely undone by a mere glance. He walked the halls of the Federation's space station in a daze, trying to clear his head. Every now and then, he would catch the glint of someone else's gaze. A technician, a guard, even another diplomat, and he could see it in their eyes. The same confusion, the same wonder, the same desire to look, but not to stare too long. It was the pheromones, he knew. The Zara were experts at manipulating their surroundings, at pulling people into their orbit. But John wasn't just anyone. He was a commander trained to resist, trained to keep his composure in the most harrowing of situations. Yet, Lady Erin's hold on him was something he hadn't anticipated. The very next day, he was scheduled for another diplomatic meeting with her. It was part of a series of talks meant to establish a peaceful alliance between humanity and the Zara. These talks were crucial, and John had to remain focused. He couldn't afford to lose himself in the allure of a single alien woman, no matter how mesmerizing she was. John arrived early at the conference room, trying to steady his breathing. He had to remind himself that this was just a meeting, a chance to further the Federation's interests. No personal feelings, no distractions. Erin arrived with her entourage, her presence immediately filling the room. The light seemed to bend around her, and John found himself swallowing hard. He took his seat across from her, trying to avoid looking directly at her. His pulse quickened, but he fought against the primal urge to look into her eyes. Erin smiled faintly, watching him, her gaze calm but intense. "Commander Ashford," she said, her voice a musical trill that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. "You seem distant today." John cleared his throat, feeling his pulse hammering in his ears. "Just focused on the talks, Lady Erin," he replied, doing his best to sound professional. "The future of our two species depends on these discussions." She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "And you believe the future of the Federation depends on your ability to resist temptation?" John's heart skipped a beat. Temptation? He hadn't expected her to say it so plainly, but in a way it was a relief. She wasn't just some distant, unattainable figure. She was aware of the effect she had on him, and she wasn't pretending otherwise. "I don't think I'm in danger of giving in to temptation, Lady Erin," John said, forcing a steadying breath. "I'm here to do my job." Her smile deepened, and John felt an unexpected warmth wash over him. This wasn't just about diplomacy anymore. It was about power, her power, the ability to influence, to control, to make him feel like he was losing control of himself without ever touching him. "You're stronger than most," Erin observed softly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Most humans would be undone by such proximity. John didn't know whether to be flattered or unnerved. He was beginning to understand that the Zara, with their advanced phenomenal abilities, didn't just rely on physical manipulation. They also wielded a kind of psychological influence. A pressure that made it hard to think clearly, to focus. "You're right," he said, trying to steady his voice. "But that's why we have to keep our focus. This alliance, it's bigger than any one person." Erin's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. For a moment, John thought he had offended her, but then her lips curled into a slow, almost predatory smile. "We will see how long that focus lasts," she murmured. John's heart skipped again. Was she threatening him? Testing him? He wasn't sure, but he refused to let his guard down. The conversation shifted back to formal matters, but even as they discussed the intricacies of the proposed alliance, trade, technology sharing, and military cooperation, John found himself fighting to concentrate. Every now and then, he would catch her watching him, her gaze heavy and almost predatory. The meeting dragged on, each moment stretching longer than the last. He could feel the heat building in the room again, the subtle pressure, the way her presence seemed to crowd every corner of his mind. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to ignore the rising sensation in his chest. Finally, when the meeting came to an end, John felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had survived. Barely. But as he stood to leave, Erin's voice stopped him. "Commander," she called softly, "do not think that your will alone will be enough to resist me. The Zara were not designed to be ignored." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You'll find that out sooner or later." John swallowed hard, his pulse racing again. She was right. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Resistance was one thing, but the longer he was exposed to her, the harder it would be to keep his mind and his heart in check. As he turned to leave, he could feel her eyes on him, not just watching, but reaching into him. He couldn't help but wonder, how long would he last? The galaxy's most dangerous diplomatic mission had just become far more complicated and far more personal. John couldn't stop thinking about Erin. He'd tried, but the thoughts came to him like waves crashing against the shore, impossible to avoid. The way her eyes lingered on him, the way her voice seemed to hum through the air like a song only he could hear. It was becoming unbearable. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Every time he looked away, he felt the pull, the magnetic force that seemed to tether him to her. He tried to distract himself with the ongoing negotiations, the meetings, the political maneuvering, but everything seemed to circle back to her. Even when they weren't in the same room, her presence lingered. Days passed, and though John kept his distance, he couldn't escape the feeling that Erin was always watching. He noticed her staring at him during council meetings, her eyes following his every movement. It wasn't subtle. She made no attempt to hide it. In fact, it seemed deliberate, intentionally drawing his attention, almost as if she were daring him to respond, to acknowledge the bond between them. But John wasn't about to let her win. He would not let her control him, no matter how tempting it might be. The tension in the air thickened as the final stages of the negotiations approached. The Zara had already made their demands clear. They wanted human technology, military support, and a firm guarantee of mutual protection. In exchange, they would share their advanced knowledge of biology, medicine, and energy sources, gifts that could push humanity into a new golden age. But there was more to the deal. Erin wasn't just here for peace talks. John had begun to realize that she had a deeper agenda, one that involved more than just diplomacy. He'd seen it in her eyes, heard it in her voice during their private meetings. She wasn't only interested in forging an alliance. She was interested in him. John had to keep his composure. The last thing he needed was to let the Zara goddess get inside his head. But the more time he spent with her, the more he wondered whether his resistance would hold. It was on the third day of intense discussions that John found himself alone in the station's observation deck late at night, attempting to clear his head. The stars stretched endlessly before him, the distant glow of galaxies twinkling beyond the glass. But even in the infinite expanse of space, he couldn't escape the magnetic pull of Erin. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. She was standing at the far end of the observation deck, her tall frame framed by the starry void outside. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply watched him. Her presence was like a force field, bending the very atmosphere around her. John's heart skipped a beat, and before he could stop himself, his feet were carrying him toward her. "You shouldn't be here alone, Commander." Erin's voice came, cool and measured, like a ripple in water. "The station is vast, and dangerous. But you've come to me, haven't you? John's mind raced, but his body moved against his will. He stopped just a few feet from her, his breath shallow. I'm here to clear my head, he said, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. She smiled, a slow, knowing grin. You can try, but I know what's really on your mind. John's pulse quickened. He could feel the heat in the room rise, though the temperature had not changed. His eyes dropped to the floor, unable to meet her gaze. He wasn't sure if he was more afraid of her control over him or his own desire to give in. Are you truly here for peace? John asked, his voice low. Or is this all a game to you? Erin tilted her head, stepping closer to him, her presence overwhelming. A game? Perhaps. But you forget, Commander, I've been alive for centuries. I've seen empires rise and fall. I understand the value of power, and I understand the value of temptation. John clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay grounded. This isn't about power, Erin. This is about survival. The Federation can't afford to get tangled in some personal game. Her eyes softened, but the intensity of her gaze never wavered. Oh, but it is, John. You see, we Zara are not bound by the same rules that govern your kind. We do not simply seek survival. We seek more. John's breath caught in his throat. He knew what she was implying, what she was offering. The power, the intimacy, the control she could wield. But he couldn't let himself be pulled into this. He couldn't afford to be distracted by her, no matter how much he wanted to be. Erin stepped even closer, her warmth seeping into his skin. You think you can resist me? She asked softly, her breath brushing against his ear. I've seen the way you look at me. I felt it, the tension between us. You've already lost, John. The question is, how far are you willing to go? John shuddered. His mind screamed at him to step back, to put up a wall between them. But his body didn't obey. Instead, he reached out, almost involuntarily, to touch her arm. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, a wave of heat surged through him, and the room seemed to shrink around them. I haven't lost yet, John whispered, though even to him, his words sounded uncertain. Erin smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. We shall see, Commander. We shall see. Before John could say anything more, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the observation deck, leaving him standing alone in the starlight. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had been so close to giving in. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. He had a job to do. He had a duty to the Federation, to humanity. He couldn't let Erin's power, her allure, be his undoing. But deep down, he knew one thing for certain. The longer he stayed in her orbit, the harder it would be to resist. The game had only just begun, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep playing. John Ashford was beginning to feel the cracks in his resolve. Every day, every conversation with Erin, every glance from her, it all felt like a tightening noose around his neck. He'd prided himself on his discipline, his focus, and his unwavering dedication to his duties as a commander of the United Earth Federation. But Lady Erin, the Lady Erin, was like nothing he had ever encountered. It had been 2 weeks since their first private meeting in the observation deck. The talks were progressing, but John felt himself slipping. The negotiations had taken a turn. No longer were they focused solely on the political and economic details. Erin had begun to weave her personal influence into every conversation, every encounter. Subtle at first, but it was becoming more direct, more invasive. John had hoped the constant exposure would wear off. He'd hoped that his willpower would prove stronger than the overwhelming pull of her presence. But every time their eyes met, he felt the world around him tilt, and his resolve wavered. The breaking point came in the midst of a crucial meeting. The Federation representatives were gathered in the main council room, a vast chamber designed for high-level discussions. The room was large enough to accommodate a dozen species representatives, each with their own unique needs. But this meeting was to be about one thing: securing the final terms of the alliance with the Zara. John sat at the head of the table, his focus on the data projected before him. But despite the importance of the discussion, his mind kept drifting. He could hear Erin's voice in his head, her words echoing with dangerous intimacy. He could feel her eyes on him from across the room, a heavy weight on his chest, pinning him to his seat. The room fell into a tense silence as the representatives debated over military cooperation. Specifically, the deployment of Federation forces in joint missions with the Zara. The conversation grew more heated, but John couldn't concentrate. His thoughts kept drifting to the last few days, where each encounter with Erin seemed to chip away at his self-control. Her whispers in his ear, her soft caresses on his arm, the way she seemed to know just what to say to make his heart race. She wasn't just manipulating the negotiations. She was manipulating him, and he was starting to realize it. He could feel the heat of her presence, even though she was seated across the room. Every time their gazes locked, it was as if she were pulling him into her orbit, sucking the air from his lungs. She wasn't being subtle anymore. She was actively testing him. He couldn't take it anymore. With a sudden movement, John stood from the table, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor cutting through the tension in the room. Everyone stopped, their eyes turning toward him. "I'll be back in a moment," he said curtly, his voice tight. Without waiting for a response, he exited the room. Once he stepped into the hallway, John's breath hitched. His chest was tight, his head pounding. He walked briskly down the hall, not knowing where he was headed, just needing to get away. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air thick with the scent of her. It was her pheromones, he knew it. Her very presence was intoxicating, laced with power, desire, and something far more dangerous. He turned a corner, and there she was. Erin stood at the far end of the hall, her posture relaxed, but her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent a jolt of electricity through his body. Her long, silver hair cascaded down her back like liquid starlight, and her skin glowed in the soft, artificial light of the station. She was dressed in a flowing, form-fitting garment that accentuated her ethereal beauty, but it wasn't her appearance that made John's knees weak. It was the aura of sheer dominance she radiated. She had been waiting for him. John stopped, unable to move, his mind reeling. He tried to gather his thoughts, but it felt like his body was betraying him. The longer he stood there, the more the heat inside him built. His heart pounded, his breathing shallow. He needed to get away from her. He knew he was close to losing everything. Erin tilted her head, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across her face. "Commander," she purred, her voice silky and almost dangerous. "You look troubled." John clenched his fists at his sides, fighting to maintain control. "I'm not troubled," he bit out, though the words felt hollow. "I just need a moment to think." "You think you can escape from me?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave, almost a whisper. "You can't, John. You've been with me from the moment we met. You've already given in." John felt the words slam into him, breaking the dam that had held his resistance in place. He hadn't realized it until now, but she was right. Every thought, every breath, every action had been governed by her presence. He had already given in piece by piece. His desire, his emotions, they had all been bled dry by her intoxicating influence. "No," John said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. "I haven't." Erin stepped toward him, closing the distance between them in a few fluid movements. She was so close now that John could feel the heat radiating from her. Her gaze was unwavering, and for the first time, John felt as if he were the one being observed rather than the observer. She reached out, fingers brushing lightly against his jaw, sending a spark of heat through him. "You've been fighting this, haven't you?" she whispered. "Fighting me, but it's futile. Your will isn't strong enough to resist me forever." John swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I won't let you control me." Erin's smile widened, her eyes glinting with something both playful and deadly. "Then why are you here? Why do you keep coming back to me, Commander?" Her touch sent a shudder through him, but John's resolve was breaking. He knew she was right. He was losing himself, slipping into the gravity of her pull, and he didn't know how much longer he could resist. Before he could respond, Aaron's lips were on his. A kiss that was both a promise and a warning. And in that moment, John realized that there was no escape. John Ashford had known this moment would come. He had tried to deny it, tried to resist, tried to convince himself that he was still in control. But as Aaron's kiss deepened, all his walls crumbled to dust. He was no longer the commander, no longer the diplomat, no longer the man who had fought so hard to keep his humanity intact. He was just his, lost in her orbit, consumed by her power. Aaron's lips were impossibly soft, her touch electric against his skin. Every rational thought, every vestige of control he had held onto for the past few weeks, melted away under the weight of her presence. It was like being caught in a storm. He couldn't fight the wind, couldn't fight the waves. They were taking him under, and he had no way of stopping it. His hands, once stiff at his sides, now found their way to her back, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her skin under the delicate fabric of her garment. Her body fit perfectly against his, a harmony of strength and grace. She had already won, and she knew it. Her tongue traced the outline of his lips, and John's pulse raced, his heart a drumbeat in his ears. She pulled back just enough to speak, her breath warm against his face. "You're mine now, John. You've always been mine." John opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to protest, to fight back, but there was nothing left. She had taken everything, his will, his control, his very sense of self. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something far more insidious. Erin was no longer just a woman. She was a force of nature, an unrelenting tide that had swept him away, leaving nothing behind but a shell of the man he had been. I can't do this," John whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "This isn't who I am. I'm not yours." Erin smiled, the expression one of absolute certainty. "You think you can deny it? You think you can walk away from me?" She cupped his face in her hands, her fingers soft but unyielding. "You're already mine, John. And you'll never leave me." The words sent a chill down his spine. "I'll never leave her." It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt like a death sentence. But there was no escaping the truth. He had already crossed the line, and there was no going back. The alliance, the federation, the future of humanity, everything had become secondary to this, to her. And now that he had given in, he couldn't help but wonder if he had ever truly had a choice. "You're wrong," John muttered, a dark laugh escaping his lips despite himself. "I didn't choose this. I didn't want this." Erin's expression softened, a flicker of something almost tender passing through her eyes. "Oh, but you did choose it, John. The moment you walked into that room, the moment you looked at me, you chose this. You just didn't realize it yet." John felt his knees weaken, and he grabbed onto her to steady himself. She was right, in a way. He had chosen her. He had let himself be pulled in, let himself be fascinated, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. He had known this would happen, but he had refused to acknowledge it until now. She was his Achilles heel, his undoing. "You think you can still fight it?" Erin whispered, leaning in closer, her lips brushing his ear. "You can't. You belong to me now. I own you." John closed his eyes, trying to shut out her voice, but the words lodged themselves in his mind, digging deeper with each passing second. He wanted to resist. He wanted to get away, to find a way out of this mess, to cling to the last shred of his dignity. But it was futile. Every part of him, his body, his mind, his very soul, was screaming for her. He was gone. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor, and John snapped back to reality. He pulled away from her abruptly, his breath ragged, his heart still hammering in his chest. Erin watched him, a curious, almost playful glint in her eyes, as if she were savoring the moment. She knew he wasn't truly gone. She knew the battle wasn't over, but she had broken him. John's gaze darted down the hallway, and he realized he had to leave. If anyone saw them, if anyone knew, he would lose everything. His position, his honor, the trust of the Federation. I need to go," John said, his voice strained. Erin didn't stop him. She didn't need to. She had already won. Instead, she simply nodded, that same knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Go then," she said softly. "But remember, John, I'll always be here, waiting." John didn't respond. He turned and walked quickly down the hall, the footsteps echoing in his ears. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and desire, each step bringing him farther from her. Yet it felt like he was still tethered to her. His body betrayed him, aching for her touch, even as his mind screamed at him to escape, to find a way to regain control. He reached his quarters and slammed the door behind him, locking it as if that would keep her away. But he knew it was useless. She was inside his mind now, and no door could shut her out. His chest heaved as he sank to the floor, his hands gripping his head. What had he done? He had fallen into the trap. He had let himself be seduced, controlled, consumed. And now there was no way out. As he sat there, lost in the silence of his room, a thought crossed his mind. What if this wasn't just about him? Erin wasn't interested in him alone. She was interested in control, complete control. And now, as John thought about the larger picture, he realized that he might not just be her conquest. He was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. The galaxy was shifting, and John Ashford had just become a pawn in the game of gods. John couldn't sleep. The darkness of his quarters felt suffocating, like a blanket of smoke that he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. The weight of his thoughts pressed against his skull, relentless and unforgiving. Erin's words echoed in his mind, each one reverberating like a distant thunderclap. "You belong to me now. I own you." He had thought that he could keep his distance, that he could protect the core of who he was, his humanity, his integrity. But now, as he lay wide awake in his bed, staring up at the sterile ceiling, he knew it had all been a lie. The moment he had looked into her eyes and felt that spark of recognition, he had lost. He tried to tell himself that it wasn't his fault, that Erin had manipulated him, seduced him, bent him to her will. But deep down he knew the truth. He had wanted her. He had let himself be swept up in her power, in her allure. The galaxy's most powerful species, the Zara, with their ancient wisdom and godlike abilities. And he, a simple human commander, had become nothing more than a pawn in their game. His thoughts kept returning to the same question. What now? He had seen the signs, felt the undercurrent of something more sinister in Erin's behavior. She wasn't just trying to seduce him. She was using him, manipulating the very core of the Federation, testing the limits of his loyalty, pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be human. And now it wasn't just about his will. It was about everything. About humanity's place in the galaxy, about the future of the Federation, about the very concept of free will. He couldn't just sit back and let it all slip away. He wasn't some puppet to be played with, and he wasn't about to let Erin or the Zara take control of everything he held dear. He had to act. But the question still remained, how? John had always been a man of action, a leader who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. But nothing had prepared him for this. He was in a situation beyond diplomacy, beyond reason. Erin wasn't just a person. She was an entire idea, a representation of power, desire, and control that had no equal. And the worst part? He wanted her. He wanted the power, the certainty that she exuded. He wanted to submit to her, to lose himself in her, to allow her to take over every part of him. It was a dangerous, insidious pull that was so much more than physical attraction. It was something primal, something deep inside of him that he had never fully acknowledged. But that wasn't who he was. Or at least it shouldn't be. The door to his quarters slid open unexpectedly, and John's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Erin stood in the doorway, framed by the soft glow of the hallway lights. Her presence filled the room, like a storm cloud filling the sky, inevitable and overwhelming. "I thought you might be alone," she said softly, her voice laced with amusement. She stepped into the room, her long legs carrying her effortlessly across the floor, her eyes never leaving his. John stood up, his body tense, his mind racing. This was it, the moment of truth. He couldn't let her get the best of him again. He couldn't let her win. "Why are you here?" John's voice was strained, his chest tight with the effort it took to keep his emotions in check. I've had enough of your games, Aaron. I know what you're doing. I know what you want. Aaron's smile was slow and almost predatory. You still think you can resist, don't you? That you can fight me? She took a step closer, her gaze locking onto his, and for the first time in days, John felt the weight of her power, her presence, pressing down on him with unrelenting force. I'm not playing a game, she said, her voice low, intimate. This isn't about seduction or manipulation, John. This is about destiny. You were chosen the moment we met, and there's nothing you can do to change it. John took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. You're wrong. I am in control of my life. I don't belong to anyone. Not to you, not to anyone. Aaron tilted her head, as if contemplating his words. You still don't understand, do you? You think you're free, that you can make choices. But that's the illusion, John. That's the lie. He didn't move, didn't flinch, even as she closed the distance between them. You're lying to yourself, Aaron whispered, standing mere inches from him now, her breath warm against his cheek. You belong to me, and you always have. John shook his head, his voice fierce. No, I choose to be my own person. I choose freedom. For a moment there was silence. The two of them stood face to face, the weight of their words hanging between them. John could see the flicker of uncertainty in Aaron's eyes, a brief flash of something he couldn't quite place. For the first time since their encounter, he saw her falter, just for an instant. And in that moment of hesitation, John made his choice. He pushed her away, not with force, but with the strength of his resolve. Aaron stumbled back, her eyes widening in surprise. But there was no anger, no rage. There was only something else. A deep, inscrutable emotion that John couldn't quite understand. Her expression was unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin line. John stepped back, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. You're wrong, Aaron, he said firmly, his voice unwavering. I am not yours. I belong to no one but myself. And I will fight you if I have to. Aaron remained still, watching him, her eyes calculating. You think you can defeat me, John? You think you can stand against the power of the Zara? You're just a man, a fleeting, fragile creature. John met her gaze without flinching. And you're not a god. You're just a woman just like me. And no matter how powerful you are, I'll never let you take control of me. For a long moment, Aaron didn't speak. She simply stared at him as if weighing his words. Then, with a final, almost wistful glance, she turned and walked away. John stood there, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had made his choice, but he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and Aaron was far from finished. But for the first time in weeks, John felt the surge of hope, the hope that he could still choose his own path. No matter what came next, he would face it on his terms. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.